Hello, you're watching a special edition of Good Morning America Now. On call, mind and mood. I'm Dr. Holly Atkinson. The National Institutes of Health estimates that 15 million American adults are clinically depressed in any given year, and about 5.7 million adults suffer from bipolar disorder. Depression is so widespread that most people know someone that has suffered at some point in their life with the condition. On today's show, we want to talk about how you diagnose depression and bipolar disorder and the ways in which those suffering from the disorders can be helped to overcome their problems. We've assembled a great panel to do just that. Joining us is Marianne Cerrone, a patient advocate for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Marianne suffers from bipolar depression, and one of her 3 children suffers from attention deficit disorder. Eric A. Rouse is also with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and institutionalized in 1996. He's since controlled his illness and has become an inspiration to many suffering from mental problems. Also with us are Dr. Simon Rigo, a psychologist at the Montefiore Medical Center here in New York City, and Dr. Melva Green, chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Women, and a psychiatrist specializing in diagnosing and treating mental, emotional, and behavioral problems. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Green, let's start with you. What's the definition of depression?
Well, depression is a clinical illness, and I'm often asked, what's the difference between being depressed and having depression? So being depressed, grief, for example, is a normal response to disappointing, demoralizing, or discouraging news. But depression, or clinical depression, or major depression, is a clinical illness, a treatable medical illness that essentially impacts how we think, how we feel, and how we behave.
Now, Dr. Rigo, there are different forms of depression. Walk us through the major different types.
Sure. So the first thing and the simplest thing to focus on is a major depressive episode. And that's the classic depression that people refer to in day-to-day speak. And that's typically a period when people feel depressed or down most of the day, nearly every day, for at least a couple of weeks, with a lot of other symptoms such as insomnia, difficulty with appetite or overeating, trouble concentrating, sometimes suicidal thinking, sometimes guilt or worthlessness. There's another type of depression which is also a little less of an intense form but may last longer, called dysthymia. And that's generally considered to be a 2-year period of depressive symptoms, maybe not as intense but more chronic.
Now tell us about bipolar disorder.
Bipolar disorder is what's traditionally been referred to as a manic depressive syndrome, where people have the low lows of depression but also have extreme highs or up periods, or manic periods as we call them, where they start having racing thoughts. They might engage in behaviors that they normally wouldn't. They might have trouble concentrating or thinking about things. They may act more impulsively, get more irritable, feel grandiose or a sense of being better than other people. And those episodes tend to cycle. Up episodes and then down episodes. And that's how we get the manic depression or bipolar condition.
Now, Dr. Green, what about postpartum depression? Oftentimes women don't experience depression until they've had their first baby.
Yes, postpartum depression is a very real illness. It happens in about 1 in 9 women, so that's very frequent, that's very common. And essentially it is major depression, what Dr. Simon spoke of during the postpartum period. Women are often used to talking about the baby blues. Well, that's something that happens in the first 24 to 72 hours. But postpartum depression is a sustained change in mood. And that mood can be depressed, it can be anxious, it can be irritable, and again with all the other associated symptoms.
Dr. Rigo, what do we know about what causes depression?
What we know is that there actually isn't a simple answer to that question. It seems to be multi-determined, or in other words, there's many different potential contributors to depression, one of which is certainly hereditary or genetics. We also know that environment plays into it, family systems play into it, and then as well life events, life stressors, all of which seem to interact to then trigger a depressive episode.
Dr. Green, are we seeing depression going up in our society, and if so, why?
I think we're beginning to talk more about depression, which I think is really a good thing. I think it's very difficult to quantify when people are not engaged in treatment or aren't coming forward for care. There's been historically a tremendous amount of stigma around getting any sort of help for any mental condition or even any psychological conditions. So I don't know that we're seeing more depression. I think we're having a better discussion, ergo this mind and mood. And I think we're talking about it more.
Although we still have a further ways to go on dealing with the stigma still exists.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The stigma is still very strong. That's why, again, it's difficult to quantify how many people are actually suffering from depression, but I think we're still grossly underestimating.
Thank you both. Throughout the hour, we'll be hearing your talkback stories about dealing with depression. Here's what Melanie from California has to say about the stigma attached to mental illness.
Living with depression is a struggle. What's even more of a struggle is pretending that you're not living with it. If it becomes publicly known that you're on medication for any sort of non-physical ailment, you'll get labeled. Depending on the rumors, you could be called things such as emo kid or drama queen or perhaps even psycho. A lot of people think that depression is directly related to just feeling sorry for yourself, that anyone on Prozac could be doing just as well on placebo. I don't have proof to support or refute that argument, but I do recall in my younger adolescence crying multiple times daily and not having a specific reason as to why. Only now does my behavior make sense to me.
We want you to continue to talk back to us. Just send us your video comments and questions by going to the I Caught section at abcnews.com. For much more information on the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness, go to abcnews.com and click on the Health tab. There you will find answers to hundreds of questions about mind and mood disorders from leading physicians across the country on call for you. We'll be right back right after this.